So we're going to hand out my periodic table of happiness elements. So you'll recall that the first day I talked about various ways in which modern science and contemplative practice could cross-fertilize each other. And one of those was the notion that something that I refer to as the spirit of science could inform the way that we teach contemplative practice. Now, the first person to begin that approach would have been who in the whole history of the world, as far as we know? Who was the first person to approach the deepest spiritual issues, perhaps not entirely with what would be called a modern scientific point of view, but something along the lines of the spirit of science? Who would have been the very first person historically? The historical Buddha. In many, and I won't repeat the details that I talked about in the last few days, but I mentioned a whole bunch of reasons why it's not a coincidence that the Buddhist tradition is playing a central role in this dialogue with the sciences. Although it's also important to recognize, and it's very enriching to recognize, that contemplative practice has existed all over the world, including in the Western world, and probably, in fact, almost certainly has its origin in the general lifestyle and the ceremonies of our tribal ancestors. So contemplative practice is much bigger than Buddhist contemplative practice, but for all the reasons I mentioned over the last few days, Buddhism has sort of come to play a central role in the current dialogue, come in a sense to represent contemplative practice of the world. And part of that is because the historical Buddha himself was proto-scientific in his outlook. So to sort of carry this on, to carry it to the next level, based on his formulations, makes a lot of sense. So one of the features of the spirit of science is the ability to think dimensionally, to analyze complex phenomena into their natural degrees of freedom, or what could be called their basic components or dimensions. And then once you've got that clear, we can start to talk about relationships between those components. So this is the thing, you can't see it from where you are, but you can just sort of get a vibe. It looks a little bit like a mandala. This is what I've been playing with for the last few days. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of concentric, well, 3 concentric spheres and then a center there. And this outermost rim represents the dimensions of your practice structure. Day-to-day practice, retreat practice, the kind of support you get, the kind of support you give, basic cycles, accelerators that we talked about. And here are the dimensions of you need one or more meditation techniques. And here are the dimensions of those techniques. And then inside here is a picture. This is the 20 boxes of the periodic table of happiness. And then This out here is a picture of 4 scales in which happiness can occur. The scale of the individual, the scale of groups of individuals, which can go from 2 people to large groups, whole nations, and so forth. And then there's all humans, and then all sentient beings in all conceivable universes over here. So we want to maximize the happy at all of these scales. The central picture is this, which is the basic qualitative dimensions of happiness. And so this gives you what's very relevant to your concerns. This is the qualitative dimensions of an individual's happiness. And as you can see, it is organized into types and levels, which are in some ways analogous to the columns and rows of the periodic table of chemical elements. In fact, I won't go into it now, I have in previous talks. The analogy is surprisingly close. So each of these 20 boxes represents a basic element or basic type of happiness. So we're cross-classifying happiness by category and then by level. So the categories are, I'm currently calling them relief, fulfillment, wisdom, mastery, and service. But relief means the whole endeavor of minimizing suffering. Fulfillment, maximizing satisfaction. Wisdom is understanding yourself at a psychological level, at an archetypal level, as a sensory system, and as a spiritual essence. Skillful action, you could see these different levels. And then service from love. Now, and then what the levels represent is not intensity and not necessarily importance, although there is a general correlation that the deeper levels tend to be more important. But the defining feature for being, quote, deeper is that that particular type of happiness is less obvious to the average person. So you start with things on the top that are obvious to anyone. It's obvious to anyone that if there's some objective circumstance in my life, or in my community, or in my nation, or in the world, and I don't like it, that I'm going to be happy if I can reduce it or eliminate it. That's obvious to anyone. You ask the average person, is there something in your life that you would like to, or is there a source of suffering that you would like to minimize or eliminate? They're going to point to situations. They're going to say, yeah, if only my brother wasn't such an asshole, or if only in my community or my country, this person was in power, or this other person was in power, depending on your opinions about things. They're pointing to an objective circumstance in the world. Do mindfulness skills, to wit, concentration, power, sensory clarity, and equanimity, and mindfulness strategies, by which I mean using the techniques of mindfulness as a kind of toolkit to achieve things you want to achieve. Do mindfulness skills and strategies have an impact on objective circumstances? A beneficial impact from your point of view. Now, your point of view might not be someone else's point of view. There's a lot of contention about the way things should be. But it's about you. So from your point of view, can we say that mindfulness skills and techniques, mindfulness skills and strategies have a positive impact to reduce suffering in terms of eliminating or reducing objective circumstances that you would like to see changed? And the answer is yes. They have an impact. However, that impact is not necessarily a direct impact. It may be that as a tendency with time, they will tend to have an impact. But they're not irrelevant. Why do I say as a tendency with time? Well, how do you change objective circumstances? You change objective circumstances by doing objective behaviors. And mindfulness skills and techniques are definitely related, as you can see over here in column 4, to acting skillfully. So the more skillfully you act, the more likely it is that you'll be able to push and pull on objective circumstances in the way that you deem appropriate. But that's an indirect effect, but it is an effect. So it's not unrelated. In Buddhism, and Hinduism and other places, there's something called karma phala nyaya. So nyaya means a law, like a physical law is a nyaya, a principle. Karma means work, W-R-K, or action. You're familiar with this term. Phala, you might not know, P-H-A-L-A, but that means fruit. So the principle of action and fruit, literally, if we were to translate the Sanskrit, but that's what is often in English called the law of cause and effect. So in Buddhist formulation and Hindu formulation, it's a kind of perfect cosmic bookkeeping, perfect cosmic accountancy. What goes around comes around. Exactly how much good you put out into the world is how many good things happen to you in the long run. Now, clearly, when we look at daily life, we see in the short run, that's not necessarily true. So Buddhism and Hinduism postulate that this runs across lives, that we have multiple lives, and yes, indeed, it all works out. Well, maybe we have multiple lives, but personally, I've never seen compelling evidence that we do. If it were to turn out that we do, I would not be surprised, but I've never seen compelling evidence, so I'm not going to try to convince you that we have multiple lives. However, I would say that as a general tendency, what goes around comes around. And that also, so that's a statistical tendency. If you act skillfully, you're likely to be able to reduce circumstances that you don't like, and you're likely to be able to have or increase desirable objective circumstances. Likely. And I would also say, so we could call that the weak law of cause and effect. Now, some of you that have a background in science and math know that I'm making a little geek pun here, okay? In statistics and in other fields, there are theorems and whatever that are called the strong law of X, and then there's often a sort of weaker or less intense version of that. It's called the weak law, like the strong law of large numbers, the weak law of large numbers, etc. So sorry, I do make geek puns and jokes and things. So, but we could draw a metaphor. It's possible that the strong law of karma may not actually be true. But I'm going to claim that the weak law of karma, which is in general what goes around comes around, is not only true, but it's really important because it's really easy to forget. And it's really easy for advanced meditators to forget. So there's a whole famous Zen story about that. You can look it up if you're interested, the master and the fox, Hyakujo's fox story. Anyway, so in terms of changing circumstances to get things the way we like, or to get them to not be the way we don't like, I'm going to say that indirectly, but significantly, mindfulness skills and strategies are related to that. Now, just to give you a sort of a broad perspective on things, each one of these boxes is itself divided into sub-boxes. And then each of the sub-boxes contains all the individual instances of that particular kind of happy. So if you think of all those sub-boxes and then you think of all the instances, each one of these boxes stores tens of thousands of specific, I want this, I don't want that human beings, not tens of thousands, trillions actually, if you multiply it over all people. So there's a lot stored in here. So the magnitude or height or intensity of your happiness can be thought of as many lines that come out of each subtype here, and they point out from the paper, starting with 0, meaning you have absolutely no happiness of that kind whatsoever, meaning you're utterly miserable with respect to that dimension, going to something that would be a max out here. So that actually the intensity of your happiness is measured by a kind of surface that sticks out from the paper. So with regards to this subtype, I have this degree of happiness. With regards to this one, I have this degree of happiness. This one, this way, this way, this way. So this is a two-dimensional qualitative map or classification of happiness. And then the amount of intensity is the third dimension that comes out here. So it's a three-dimensional model. Then the fourth dimension of happiness is, well, how many individuals, let's back up. So maximizing happiness means that your happiness is as broad as possible, covers all of these dimensions. It's as deep as possible, it covers all of these levels. And with respect to each of those, it's as high, or its magnitude is as great as possible. And that gives you a three-dimensional picture of optimizing an individual's happiness. And then the number of individuals whose happiness is optimized, that is the global happiness of this world. That is the fourth dimension, the scope. Am I a happy person? Okay. How happy are the people around me? How happy are the people in my division of my company, in my whole company, in my community, in my country, et cetera, et cetera. It just gets wider and wider until we've got the whole world. And I'm going to suggest to you that for each level of social organization, there are going to be specific factors that will tend to spread mindfulness-based happiness, and there are going to be factors that would tend to impede it. And knowing what those are is going to be very useful. Obviously, that's very complex, and I'm not going to even begin to talk about that. What I am going to talk about is, and it's plenty complex enough, is how to optimize your happiness, the happiness of a given individual. Specifically, the central role of mindfulness skills and strategies in doing this. So what this is designed to do is manyfold. It's a sort of model that a modern mindfulness teacher could use to check in with people on their practice. You will recall that I said that the level of professionalism in mindfulness teaching is measured by the degree to which you can start someone out with a very small concept of of happiness, and then seamlessly extend that until it fills the whole grid. Now, why is that important? Well, we're at an interesting point in the history of the world, because on one hand, there's this thing that's called mindfulness that looks like lots of people are interested in, and they think it's something important. So inevitably that leads to pushback. People saying, oh, mindfulness is just bullshit. And here's why. So when you look at the mindfulness is bullshit articles, it becomes very evident what the problem is. The problem is that they're using a very, very ham-fisted and limited definition of what mindfulness is. So of course it's a straw man that you can easily knock down and therefore get attention. Look like you have something important to say that people should listen to you. So on the other hand, we have people from the traditional Buddhist world who are concerned that modern mainstream mindfulness is going to represent a watering down of the spiritual clout of the culture of origin of mindfulness, and also a loss of the ethical compass. So Mac Dharma. So I'm going to suggest to you that this is the answer to all those problems. A careful reading of this will show you the central nature of mindfulness with regards to human happiness. And its awesome power, but also it will give you a realistic picture of its limitations. And furthermore, it will give you a list of supplements, what you can do to supplement the list of the things that mindfulness can't give you, so as to optimize your happiness in a very broad paradigm. So when we talk about, okay, we're afraid that we're going to lose the spiritual essence, and we're afraid that we're going to lose the ethical compass, etc., etc. So we have to think very deeply about what we mean by spiritual. And we have to think very deeply about what we mean by character or ethics. There is a tendency to say that spiritual equals a certain kind of content of see, hear, feel. Certain mental images are spiritual. Certain mental talk is spiritual. Certain body emotions are spiritual. So if we want to not lose the spiritual dimension, we have to make sure that those images and that talk and those body sensations are part of it. Certain sights are spiritual, certain sounds are spiritual, certain physical actions and sensations are spiritual. If we want to maintain the spiritual, we don't want the spiritual aspect to be watered down, we have to make sure that we're including those sights, those sounds, those physical sensations. So if you start to think of spiritual only as that, then it's not going to work out, because different individuals and different cultures have very different inner and outer see, hear, feel definitions of spiritual. And we want something that's going to fly for almost all people in almost all cultures. So should we bring in more ritual? Should we bring in prayer? Should we bring in this? Should we bring in that to make sure that mindfulness doesn't get watered down? Well, you're very welcome to do that in your own local program, but I'm going to suggest that from the viewpoint of changing the course of human history, that's going to immediately start excluding people. So can we not lose the spiritual dimension and also not exclude anybody? Sure, by remembering that the things that I just mentioned, certain content in inner and outer see, hear, feel, those things are dimensions of spirituality, but they're not the deepest dimension of spirituality. And fortunately for us, the deepest dimension of spirituality can be maintained, retained, in a way that is acceptable to everyone. But we need to place it within a context so that it seems ordinary. Just sort of, well, yeah, of course. So, in the center here is something that's rather innocuously called understand yourself. So, 4 levels of understanding yourself. Most people are interested in understanding their own personality. They're interested in understanding themselves at a psychological level. To do so, they may introspect, meaning they just sort of think about themselves, think about their life, or they may go to someone that's a professional, to a therapist, a counselor, and so forth. Nothing unusual about that in any culture. Why are you going? To understand yourself. Well, there's different levels of the self. You can understand yourself on a surface level, but certain forms of psychology deal with understanding sort of a deeper level of self, an archetypal level. Depth psychology, or the kind of psychological issues that you would go to maybe your minister for, and so forth. Things related to what in Buddhism is called the Sambhogakaya, the subconscious, the deep subconscious. You might go to a shaman for that kind of thing. It's a deeper level of self. And most people have had some contact with that deeper level of self. Sometimes, particularly in traditional societies, it comes up in image space, where people see spirits, angel. A lot of people claim that they've seen angels, okay, et cetera, remember former lives. Well, this is a deeper level of self. And most people would not be averse to the notion that beyond the surface there's some deeper things. So to understand yourself at a deep psychological level makes sense. But how about can we go a little deeper? Understand yourself as a sensory system. What does that mean? Well, how do you have a sense of self? How does it arise? Moment by moment, I'm going to suggest it arises through three things: mental image, mental talk, and body emotion. And as soon as you show someone that, everyone sees it. There's nothing mysterious about it. You define mental images, and then you say, okay, and you define it carefully, because people often assume that you're going to ask them to detect something that's undetectable or very special. So you have to define it in a certain way so they understand that it's probably going to be a fleeting, vague impression of form. It's not necessarily going to be vivid and stable like a photo or the real world. And then you just have them note the presence or absence of mental image. If they claim they have no mental images at all, then you give them a special exercise. You say, okay, don't worry about that, but we're going to observe your thought in a new way. If you're thinking about a person, say person. If you're thinking about a place, say place. If you're thinking about a physical object, say object. Person includes yourself, place includes where you are, object could include things around you with your eyes closed. So just say, and then if you're not thinking about anything, or you're not thinking at all, or you're not thinking about those things, then just say none. And so they're going person, person, none, place, object, object, person, like that. And then you say, okay, well, each time you said person or place or object, I'd like you to see if there's an impression of form of that person, place, or object. So then they do it. And then you say, okay, and you ask, was there an impression of form? And of course, there always was, every time they said person, place, or object. Then you say, that's what I mean by a mental image. So if they didn't get it the first time around, you give them the special exercise, everyone gets it. And by the way, it's a big epiphany for a lot of people when they realize that they, in fact, think in images. Okay, no one has much difficulty detecting the presence or absence of mental talk. How about body emotion? Well, maybe in daily life it's not so obvious, but when something intense happens that's emotional, it becomes very obvious that body sensation is involved. So you just have someone wait till something intense is happening emotionally, or you have them listen to something that warms their heart or frosts their buns, and then they notice that the body is involved here. Nothing all that mysterious about any of this. Anyone can understand these categories. Then you have them work with that until they start to notice certain things. What? Well, maybe they'll notice that every now and again, that system goes offline. It deactivates. And their sense of self goes away. And then they'll also notice that when they're able to keep track of those components, their sense of being trapped and identified with them goes away, but when they lose track, the sense of being trapped and identified comes back. Well, now they're starting to get insight into the nature of the small self and possibly some visage of freedom from the small self. Now, in the Buddhist tradition, what I'm describing is part of the centerpiece of spirituality. Buddhist spirituality centers around liberation from the limited identity. I just described to you a focus procedure that anyone can do. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's nothing threatening about it. Yet, as they're doing it, they're going to start to get some insights that, as far as the Buddhist tradition goes, are central to the really important dimension of spirituality, which is not certain kinds of mental image, certain kinds of mental thought, certain kinds of body emotion. It's not certain kinds of sights or sounds or touches. It rather is the core insight of the historical Buddha, which is when you analyze selfhood into its basic dimensions, there is a liberation. Now that's the centerpiece of spirituality, and there's no reason whatsoever that will disappear in mainstream mindfulness, as long as it's on the radar of mindfulness teachers. If it's not on the radar of mindfulness teachers, then yes, maybe there'll be a watering down of the spiritual dimension. ¿Qué más? What more? Well, as you're paying close attention to inner see, hear, feel, you may start to notice not only a liberating effect from the untangling and unblocking, you may start to notice that in fact it's all sort of made out of vibrating space. And as you notice that, you'll notice that external touch, sight, sound, touch is made out of the same stuff. Now, experiencing self and world as you go about ordinary activities as a kind of vibrant dance of space, dynamic, but also attenuated, would seem to me to be sort of the essence of what the English word spirit means. Spirit is wind, ruach, breath, chi, ki. So, without anything particularly weird, we've gone from, sure, I'd like to understand myself better. I look within, and then I look a little deeper, and then I analyze it in terms of some very straightforward categories. And wow, okay, my relationship to my mind and body is beginning to change, and then it changes at the deepest level here. You discover the primordial perfection, the spiritual source that moment by moment manifests self and seen. And this is all on a seamless continuum. So we have now made classical enlightenment ordinary. It's just part of being happy. It's a very deep part, but it has a place. It's under the category of understand yourself. Once someone says they're interested in that category, and once they say that they understand that there can be levels at which we can understand ourselves, and you point out how the inner system is one of those levels. So there you go. We haven't lost any of the spiritual clout whatsoever. Liberation is just a place on a happiness grid. It happens to be central, it happens to be deep, but it's in a context where you can seamlessly move between these boxes as you're extending, you're broadening and deepening people's concept of what happy is for them. Okay, well, how about the, quote, ethical compass? Well, here's where we tend to think, okay, well, we got to bring ethics into this, or morality. So what does that mean? Well, there's these rules. You don't do this, you don't do that. Maybe even there are certain political opinions. This is the way a government should be. This is the way a government shouldn't be. This is the way a corporation should be. This is the way a corporation shouldn't be. Well, people have all sorts of ideas about these things, and those ideas are certainly worthy to be listened to. But is that the first thing we should be thinking about if we want to change the course of human history? This is the first thing we should be thinking about, that we're going to go in with a critique of people's behaviors based on a set of rules. I think guidelines have a place. We recited certain guidelines before this retreat. 4 of them pretty universal, 1 of them relevant to a recovery community. They're pretty general, and I think that there's utility in talking about it, but I think it's part of a much larger picture, and that's not exactly what I would lead with. It would be part of the picture, but it's not the first thing that comes to my mind if I want to attract the majority of human beings to a revolutionary re-engineering of who they are. So where do you start? Some people get even more specific. They say we should start with politics. So that's definitely going to alienate a lot of people right off the bat. Polarize. Now, if you have a mindfulness group and you have a certain political point of view and you think it's important, fine, go ahead. That's your prerogative to incorporate that into your group. That's okay. But my job is to strategize the big picture of how we're going to hopefully change the course of human history. So from that point of view, leading with politics seems to me to not be a very good idea. If you want to reach almost everyone, right? So is there something we should lead with? Is there a way to get a crack in the door, a foot in the door, to make a beginning with respect to what we call Shila in Buddhism, which is character? Now, first of all, I think it's interesting that Shila means character. It doesn't mean precepts, even though we use it to mean that. Sushila means having good character. Dushila means having bad character. Shila can be good or bad. It's your character. It's how you typically carry yourself in the world. What we call the Shila, these guidelines, are general guidelines for carrying yourself in the world. But character is character. So we want to get just about anyone on board with the notion of improving character. How do we do it? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that regardless of who you are, there are aspects of your behavior that you would like to change. It's universal. Doesn't matter what your view of the world is. Behavior change comes in 8 categories. It can be big or it can be small. It can be positive or it can be negative. By positive, I mean taking on something you've been putting off. That's a good thing. By negative, I mean letting go of something you've been doing that is not a good thing. It can be big, it can be small, it can be positive, it can be negative. Everyone understand what I mean by positive or negative? Taking on something versus stop doing something, right? It can be something that you are committed, a change you're committed to making, or it can be a change you're merely willing to consider making. So that's 2 times 2 times 2. That's 8 possible broad categories of desirable behavior change. There's no human being that doesn't have some items that fit somewhere in that classification. Are mindfulness skills and techniques relevant to making desirable behavior changes? Absolutely. Because behavior is objective behaviors, what we do, say, and to a certain extent what we think when we think about thinking as a motor activity. This is the 3 karma dwara. These are the 3 gates of action in traditional Buddhism. Kaya, vak, chitta. Kaya karma, body actions. Vak karma, speech actions. Chitta karma or mano karma is mental actions. Notice in Buddhism, mind is both a sensory experience and a motor behavior. So you have mano vijnana, which is thinking as a sensory event. I call it image and talk. And then, but you also have mana karma, which is your intentional thought actions, which are looked upon as one of the 3 forms of karma. So actions are, which are something objective in the world, are preceded by sensory states. You want to stop smoking. So if you abstain from, so that's a desirable behavior change. It's a negative one. You're stopping doing something that's not a good thing. And it's a big one. Ain't easy to stop smoking. Why? Because when you stop smoking, you get uncomfortable physical sensations. And associated with that are uncomfortable emotional sensations. And you get images of yourself smoking, and you get pleasant body emotions associated with that image. And then you get mental talk that says, oh, I'll just have one, or I deserve it, or whatever. So that's feel out, feel in, see in, hear in. That's 4 sensory components that constitute the sensory experience of the drive to start smoking again. Your mindfulness skills and strategies can be used to deconstruct that sensory experience over and over and over again. So very relevant to behavior change. So where to start? You start with, at some point as a teacher, as you're interviewing your student and finding out all the things that they want, when it's appropriate and not intrusive, you find out what things they want to change about their behavior. And then you show them how to use mindfulness to do that. Now you've opened the door. Maybe there's other things they want to change. And as they become a happier and happier person, maybe their concept of skillful action begins to evolve, and their value system changes. And when they're ready to make other kinds of changes, well, that's already something we've been doing. It's just on a continuum of what we've already been doing. And it's all very natural and very easy. Now, okay. So this is a checklist for a modern mindfulness teacher to, and it contains my answer to some of the problems with modern mindfulness, like it's bullshit, or it's going to get watered down and co-opted by evil forces or whatever, okay? So this will militate against that happening. Okay, now this is a classification of happiness that is based on a very specific goal. So it's actually, I don't offer it as some sort of philosophical contribution to positive psychology. It's not, it is theoretical, but it's not something that I'm saying is some sort of universal thing. It is a view of happiness from a very specific point of view, which is to what extent we want to clarify the role, both the power and the limitation of mindfulness to maximize human happiness. Now, it turns out that when we go through this, box by box, which we're not going to do now, but I think you get the general idea how this would work. When you go through box by box, you will be able to see, here's the mechanism whereby mindfulness will increase this particular type of happiness for you. Here's the limitations, and here's what to do about the limitations. For example, are mindfulness skills and techniques all you need in order to make positive behavior changes? Well, sometimes, but sometimes other things are needed. And we can list what those other things are. General guidelines, accountability and support structure. Keep the feedback channels in your life and in your institution open so that the information can flow to you about how you're carrying yourself in the world. Have realistic role models for what constitutes admirable behavior. None of the things I just listed are mindfulness skills or techniques or strategies, but they're factors in behavior change. If you have the mindfulness skills and techniques and you have all of these factors in place, there is a very, very high probability that you will become a very, very admirable person. I use admirable not in the sense that we're trying to get people to say we're good. Admirable to me translates the ancient Sanskrit term mensch. It's the ancient Jewish term. Magvia mensch, be a good person. I guess it's in my background, right? Because I heard that at a very early formative age in synagogue, right? From rabbi, from the cantor. It's like, that's, in fact, I think it's the first thing I ever heard as a spiritual whatever. I think it's Maimonides, right? In a place where there are no men, okay, pardon the sexist language, but you know what men means. It means match, okay? In the place where there are no men, be thou a man. So be that extraordinary person in terms of how you carry yourself in the world. So, you need a bunch of things, but I'm going to claim that the mindfulness skills and strategies play a pretty central role in this. They make it possible. You know, there's that great Simpsons episode. I sometimes talk about it. There's a lot of Buddhism in The Simpsons, by the way. You should get the episode where Bart's sister has him work on the koan, what is the sound of one hand clapping? I swear to God, there is a Simpsons episode to that effect. But the episode that I like, my favorite one, is at school, they ask, the teacher asks, what's your family's religion? And Bart and what's the sister's name? I always forget. Lisa. They don't know what their family's religion is. So they go home and over the dinner table, it's like, what's our family religion? And Homer, he sort of like has to think, and he's hemming and hawing, and he says, you know, it's the one with all the good ideas that don't work out in the real world. You know, Christianity, that's our family religion. The one with all the good ideas that don't work out in the real world. I love that episode. Well, actually, those good ideas do work out in the real world if you combine them with mindfulness skills. Otherwise, yeah, maybe very difficult to live that. Father Johnston, whose book you can see in that bookstore there, was a friend of mine, a Catholic priest when I was in Japan. One of the last things he told me before I left Japan is how grateful he was to Buddhism, because after 20 years of Zen meditation, he has realized it actually is possible to be a Christian. So Homer's, but in just 20 years of Zazen, okay, to realize that, yeah, you can actually do this. So that gives the lie to Homer Simpson's thing. But anyway, what about changing circumstances? Are mindfulness skills and techniques all you need to do that? No, you need other things. Well, lots of other things, including luck. So other factors enter in. Some people ask me, some people are, when they're dissatisfied with how things are going in the political domain or whatever, it's like, what should we do, Shinzen? And my answer is simple. Love deeply and act effectively. I would suggest to you that mindfulness skills and strategies are pretty central to loving deeply and acting effectively. Okay, so it has a very special purpose. I say that because certain types of happiness that are near and dear to people are not going to appear in the top categories here. For example, finding meaning is not one of these 20 boxes. Finding your life's work, which is or your métier, your calling, very important to a lot of people. It's not one of these top boxes, okay? So you might think, well, okay, he doesn't care about those things, but no, okay? This is designed specifically to point out the power and limitations of mindfulness. And I'm going to claim that when you go through carefully, you will see that mindfulness is either directly or indirectly relevant to every single kind of happiness. So what about all that other stuff, the stuff that doesn't seem to be on here? Well, it's on here. It's just not in the top categories because these categories are designed to analyze the effect of mindfulness. Where is it? Well, remember there are subtypes. And also, happiness is not just one of those subtypes, there are combinations. So the forms of happiness that don't seem to be on this grid, if you were to ask me, where's that, where's this other thing? I would point out to you that it's a combination of subtypes. It straddles several categories. And that's the way it has to be because this is designed for a very specific purpose. So this becomes a motivation to practice. It makes enlightenment and character just part of being happy. It provides explanatory mechanisms for how mindfulness works. And it suggests strategies for achieving these goals and tells you what you need in addition to mindfulness in order to achieve them. So that when someone says, is it worth it to establish a structure of practice? Is it worth it to learn techniques? You can show them that it's easily worth the price of admission. And that's what I have to say about that.